Viewer discretion is advised.
Dan Snyder has tried all sorts of things in his 20-year-plus ownership, and all of them have been disasters. So when he decided to finally listen to the football people instead of signing washed-up free agents in the offseason, truly this would finally work. And after Joe Gibbs made the playoffs 2 of the 3 years, things have been outright terrible. Let's talk about the stud QB taken in the 2012 draft. No, not RG3, Kirk Cousins. Actually, let's talk about RG3. After trading a king's ransom and picks for the Heisman winner out of Baylor, it seemed to pay off, well, until his knee exploded. Then they turned to Cousins, who took over after 7 total wins in 2 seasons. He won a division and they rewarded him with consecutive franchise tags, even though he wanted a long-term deal. After he left for Minnesota, they rebooted and started Mark Sanchez, and now are currently trotting out Alex Smith, aka Robo-Leg. They went 3-13 last year to get Chase Young, so we'll see how this current tank goes. Not well so far. The old ball coach's stick might have worked in the SEC, but up north, his act wore out pretty quick, going 12-20 with the football team skins. That's probably what you get when you try to run the run and shoot offense with Patrick Ramsey and Danny Awful. Special mention, Jim Zorn. And for our final, extremely hard no. Reflective of the organization that resides in this dump, the NFL would likely choose to cancel the Super Bowl or host it in London before it had one at FedEx. Yes, after 9/11, it was briefly considered that the stadium could get a Super Bowl, but after MetLife hosted one and got extremely lucky with decent weather, but a terrible game, all that talk got squelched. Parking here is a nightmare. Access to this place is a nightmare. Traffic is a nightmare. Maybe the game day experience is over at the Landover Mall? Maybe both teams practice in the parking lot? Sorry, the only Super Bowl the Washington football team will see anytime soon is highlights from 1993. If we're going all time, Washington owns the greatest home defeat. In fact, the largest home loss in the history of the league. That came in the 1940 championship game when the Bears came to DC and dropped a 73-0 shutout in the biggest game of the year. But because we're going from 1960 to present, Washington's worst home loss was a 35-point beatdown by the Chiefs. Another soon-to-be redacted team name. Oh yeah, cancel crew's coming for them. And finally, we end with the Commanders. The only reason they are last on this list because the name is somehow less generic than football team, and I almost forgot about them. Dan Snyder hiding on his yacht is the most hilarious thing I've ever seen. And when he does make it to the stadium, he's too busy fucking up Sean Taylor's memorial and letting Jackson Mahomes dance on Taylor's number. Seriously? You couldn't use that money that you skimmed from the other owners to put it together a decent event? Or fix up your absolute trash heap of a stadium? And we hadn't even gotten to the on-field product. You think Carson Wentz is gonna fix this shit pile?
Philly didn't want you. Indy didn't want you. Do you think this is your last chance to prove that you can be a starting quarterback in the NFL?
But now, I'll just end with this.
Washington, new kicker today. Chris Blewett. And, yeah, well, you saw it right.
Please either die, sell, or both. Washington Commanders. This is probably the most unusual case of literally the entire planet of 7 billion people wishing an owner would sell, and the owner wishing he had 7 billion hands so he could give each of us the middle finger. The only way Dan Snyder would ever sell the team is if he was forced to, and up until recently that didn't seem like a possibility, but things are mounting up. From a workplace misconduct allegation that included a hefty fine and forced Snyder to give up day-to-day operations of the team, okay, to him keeping 2 sets of books and skimming money from other owners. Oh, and that investigation isn't by the league, it's by Congress. The US government hates this dude. Couple that with the email scandal, the naming fiasco, the stadium being an absolute shithole. It's like the franchise is a toy that needs to be taken away from its petulant, toddler-like owner. Remember, he sued a newspaper for criticizing him. None of that though, not even Congress matters, as it would be up to the NFL owners to remove Snyder. And I doubt Jerry Jones wants to give up 2 easy wins a year. It's no secret FedEx Field is a dump. literally. When it's not spewing drainage onto their fans or its grass literally ending careers, it's also difficult to get in and out of and overall just sucks, as it is consistently rated the worst stadium in the NFL. Despite knowing all this and the stadium coming to the end of its life, there is no set plan for where a new place will be. So far, 3 potential sites have been named in Virginia, which includes Sterling, Woodbridge, and Dumfries. And if you are from the DMV, none of these would excite you, as you know traffic would suck at all 3. Yeah, Dumfries. Maryland has proposed a plan right next to the old one, and DC wants to build a new one on the side of the abandoned RFK Stadium. Either way, with Dan Snyder's future as the team's owner uncertain because you can't steal from the other owners, and the area being known for red tape, it could take a while for the Commanders to get new digs. Hopefully nobody actually dies before then. Snyder, Washington Commanders. I feel like I've covered how hated Dan Snyder is so much on this channel that it's a pretty tired act. But it could not be a video about hated owners if the sewage spiller himself wasn't on the list. He's allegedly pimped out his cheerleaders to sell luxury boxes. He himself is at the center of a harassment lawsuit. Congress wants to call him on the carpet, but he's hiding on his yacht. It is kind of interesting that they went through all of his emails and didn't find a thing. However, they haven't looked at any other team's emails. Interesting. Overall, he's tone deaf to how much he's hated. He meddles in team affairs and roster moves, though he swears he doesn't. He treats the fans like shit, his stadium is shit, and he can't take criticism. I'm honestly tired of talking about how much he sucks.
Washington. How the fuck do you even slander a team that's literally called football team? As an Eagles fan, I rarely see Washington fans ever pop up in anything. It's almost as if they don't even exist. As long as Dan Snyder is in charge, you will never win anything. Even the rare years where you make the playoffs, you always barely sneak in and get destroyed immediately once there. The only time in the last 30 years there has ever been any sort of hope for the future in DC was during RG3's rookie year in 2012. Then his knee did the stanky leg in the playoffs and he was exposed without his freakish athleticism to aid him shortly thereafter. Your entire franchise is just one big joke. Even though Ron Rivera is an easy guy to root for as head coach, he will probably be fired in 2 years. At least this year we don't have to listen to announcers talk about Alex Smith like he's a Make-A-Wish kid every time he drops back to pass. Your team has a legit defense and a budding future superstar in Chase Young, but we all know that doesn't mean much in the big picture. There has never been any stability since Joe Gibbs retired for the first time after 1992. Hell, even 2 of the 3 Super Bowls your team has won came in strike-shortened seasons that have asterisks next to them. Despite everything I mentioned, and despite how terrible Snyder is, your team might still be better run than Congress, which says a lot about this country. Washington Commanders, Ralph Guglielmi. Ralph Guglielmi sounds like a Sopranos character, but really he was just a shitty NFL quarterback from the 50s and 60s. Drafted 4th overall by Washington in 1955, he never came close to living up to the high expectations. In just 4 years with Washington, he started 21 games, going 5-13-3. He threw for 17 touchdowns and 40 interceptions for a 43.5 passer rating. Very, very stinky. Washington, Super Bowl 18. Believe it or not, Washington was once an elite NFL franchise, and in 1983 they were fresh off of a Super Bowl win. They dominated offensively, finishing 14-2 thanks to their record-setting offense. They barely squeaked by San Fran in the NFC Championship game to reach Super Bowl 18 against the Raiders, and they entered the game as 2-point favorites, but things very quickly went south for them. LA scored on a fumble recovery in the end zone and had a crucial pick 6 just before halftime to take a 21-3 lead. Washington cut it to 21-9, but then Marcus Allen took over, scoring back-to-back touchdowns. Washington ended up losing by 29 points in what was the most unexpected Super Bowl blowout until the Broncos got stomped by the Seahawks 30 years later in Super Bowl 48. And finally, the Washington Commanders, Chase Young. Chase Young, whose name translates to Jerry Sandusky, has always been a bit overrated in my opinion. He had a good rookie season, but is yet to really make an impact as a pass rusher, only having 9 sacks through 24 career games. His tackles for loss and quarterback hit stats aren't super impressive either. I need to see him get to the quarterback more before I join the hype. Washington Commanders, Doug Williams. Williams is most famous for his stellar performance in Super Bowl 22 versus Denver, which ended with him becoming the first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl. However, his accomplishments with the franchise really begin and end there. He had a few good games at the right time in a Nick Foles type of fashion, but he's considered a franchise legend despite starting just 17 games for the team over 4 years. Ironically though, I would argue Williams' time in Tampa Bay is underrated, so I guess it cancels out. out. Washington Commanders, Terry McLaurin. Scary Terry is the best player the Commanders have. He has incredible hands and body control, and he has needed to use all of his talent to get 1,000-yard seasons despite having dog shit throwing him the ball his entire career. Carson Wentz will be the best quarterback McLaurin has ever had, which is saying a lot. If he stays healthy, I expect him to put up career numbers. And finally, Washington Commanders, Carson Wentz. Wentz has been one of the most made fun of quarterbacks in the league since his 2017 injury. While at first I thought the criticisms he received were unfair, over time he has proven most of them right. He's an average quarterback who struggles in the clutch, and that's a big reason the Colts got rid of him despite respectable numbers. Verdict: properly rated. Washington Commanders. As a fan of an NFC East team, I don't even really recognize Washington. Once every 4 years or so, they do well enough to steal the division before going one and done in the playoffs, and then they get forgotten about again. This once proud franchise hasn't made an NFC Championship game since 1991, which is also the last time they won a Super Bowl, which also happens to be the only time they won a Super Bowl in a full season. 2 of their 3 Super Bowl wins came in strike-shortened seasons. So do those 2 rings really count? I don't know. Did Kevin Durant take the hardest road joining a 73-win team to get 2 rings? You tell me. Everybody hates Dan Snyder, and Carson Wentz is one of the most hated quarterbacks in the league for some reason, despite never being arrested or hurting anybody. So I'll just say that Chase Young is massively overrated, and Sean Taylor is massively overrated by a lot of people who try to project how his career would have gone if not for his tragic death. He might have become a Hall of Famer, but sadly, we'll never know. Regardless, people really need to stop putting him in the same class as legendary safeties like Ed Reed and Ronnie Lott off of 3.5 seasons.
Since this issue came back into the forefront, Daniel Snyder takes a public stance, and in his words, he says he will never change the name of the team.
Snyder says, quote, "We'll never change the name. It's that simple. Never. You can use caps."
Redskins owner Dan Snyder says he will never change the team name.
They were the Washington Redskins from 1933 to 2019. In 2020 and 2021, they were the Washington football team. In 2022, they became the Washington Commanders. 3 names in 3 years and 2 disastrous rebrands. And they weren't cheap. I'm not talking about just money. Today, we're looking at the true cost of the failed Washington Commanders rebrand. And that's coming up. Before we get to Washington Commander branded Teslas on a mission of doom, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, the history of the name. In the far north of Newfoundland, the Beothuk tribe painted their bodies with red ochre. Nearby, white settlers in Canada referred to them as red men. Throughout the 1700s, the term red man evolved into red skin, a moniker Native Americans used to identify and distinguish themselves from the white Europeans who had sailed to North America and began populating the continent. The first official use of the word redskin came in 1769 as part of negotiations between the Piankashaws of the Midwest and Colonel John Wilkins of the British Army. It was until 1823, however, that redskin entered the popular lexicon in North America. Author James Fenimore Cooper published The Pioneers, a novel that was surprisingly sympathetic towards Native Americans. A few decades later, the term started to take a more negative connotation. L. Frank Baum, who later authored The Wizard of Oz, celebrated the death of Sitting Bull at the Battle of Wounded Knee, writing, "With his fall, the nobility of the redskin is extinguished, and what few are left are a pack of whining curs who lick the hand that smites them." Alright, so who knew L. Frank Baum was kind of a dick? The term was still being used with a somewhat neutral connotation, but that pendulum was starting to swing to the other side. In 1932, a Tom and Jerry cartoon called Redskin Blues depicted Native Americans in a stereotypical manner, primitive and violent. A year after that cartoon, George Preston Marshall, the owner of the then Boston Braves, changed his team's name to the Boston Redskins. According to the team, Washington adopted the name in honor of former coach William Lone Star Dietz, who identified as Native American. Allegedly, George Preston Marshall would require Lone Star to wear a Sioux headdress on the sidelines, and he wanted players to wear war paint on the fields. Of course, this is all according to team attorneys, who almost a century later wanted to establish that the name Redskins was adopted as a badge of honor rather than a racial epithet. But there are plenty of theories that Lone Star Dietz wasn't Native American at all. Some historians claim that Dietz was simply a German American who wanted to play football with a Native American identity to cash in on the fame of one of his good friends, Jim Thorpe. The history is foggy at best, but team lawyers tried to twist it in a way that helped the team keep their name. And for a while, it worked. Until, of course, it didn't. The name redacted. In 2013, the Washington, then Redskins, avoided an all-out assault by the media, DC Council, and Native American activists who fought to change the name. It felt like Dan Snyder had won, this time for good. But the tide had shifted. Multiple publications like Slate and the New Republic decided they would no longer refer to the team by their name, but rather as the Washington NFL Team. Furthermore, from 1971 to 2013, roughly 2/3 of amateur athletic teams bearing Native American iconography changed their names and logos. While the world was shifting around them, Washington remained on an island. For another 7 years, the issue stayed dormant. Fringe publications would call the team whatever they wished, but it looked like the name Redskins was here to stay. Of course, in 2020, everything changed.
Large crowds of demonstrators in multiple cities getting more violent following the death of George Floyd.
As pressure mounted, Dan Snyder had nowhere to hide. Scrutiny was one thing, and Snyder had shown that he was shameless when it came to that. But money is far more persuasive. In July of 2020, the holy trinity of NFL sponsors spoke up. Nike, Pepsi, and FedEx publicly pressured Washington into a name change. Finally, after 90 years, the name Redskins was gone. For 2 seasons, they would be known as the Washington Football Team. This was, of course, designed as a placeholder name. Some fans grew attached to the generic titles, citing inspiration from European soccer clubs, but many Washington fans were caught up in the drawn-out, at times comical search for a permanent moniker. Red Wolves, Red Hogs, Sentinels, Presidents, Admirals. These were just some of the potential names for Washington as they sought to rebrand their team. However, on February 2nd, 2022, they pulled the trigger after a year and a half of being known as just the Washington Football Team. Now they were the Commanders, a new name, new logos, and new uniforms.
The Commanders is the new name? The Commanders, bro?
For the second time in under 2 years, they had rebranded. That can't be cheap, can it? So let's finally answer the question. What did these rebrands cost? Let's start with the first one. When the Washington Redskins became the Washington Football Team, it was designed as a placeholder move, but they still had to rebrand, remarket, and most importantly, they had to win over a fan base whose support was and is still waning. There are a few considerations for a temporary rebrand. First of all, you have the fact that you're taking a multi-million-dollar process and multiplying it times 2 over the course of 569 days. Nice. That's a hefty price tag. It's fair to assume that since the transition from Redskins to Football Team was so quick, the rebrand might land on the cheaper side of the cost spectrum. Likely in the ballpark of $10 million or less. Because the second rebrand took so long and involved several outside consults and extensive research, the cost of that one likely exceeded $20 million. All in all, because no official figures are available to the public, it's safe to assume the final bill ran around $30 to $40 million. No small chunk of change. But here's the eye-opening catch. The Washington Commanders are worth roughly $3.5 billion. They were the first NFL franchise to be valued at $1 billion, but their growth relative to other teams has slowed down over the last 2 decades. To put it simply, they couldn't afford not to rebrand. And they needed the placeholder name to satisfy sponsors like FedEx, who would have cost the team $10 million per season had they removed their naming rights on the stadium. Without sponsorships, the team would be bleeding money in a league that seems to be printing more and more cash every season. The placeholder bought them time and money to make a permanent change to the Commanders, a change that could actually become a windfall for Daniel Snyder, and thanks to revenue sharing, the NFL as a whole. Yeah, after all this, that pig still somehow wins. Changing signage and logos comes at a one-time fee, but merchandise is forever. The fan base, apart from a few stubborn old-timers, will likely spring to replace their Redskins gear with Commanders gear, while the Washington Football Team becomes instant memorabilia that can be sold as vintage merch to the ironic hipster industrial complex. Washington and the rest of the NFL was going to lose money if they stuck with their old name. Not to mention the Commanders will no longer have to retain expensive lawyers that will fight for the right to keep an outdated name. Now they only need to retain expensive lawyers to settle their sexual harassment lawsuits. Of course, had Dan Snyder and the team had a contingency plan in place from the get-go, he could have avoided doing 2 rebrands, and that would have saved the team the cost of the first rebrand. But since Daniel Snyder is an arrogant prick who said he would never change the name, of course he didn't have a plan in place. Those words cost him millions of dollars, but in the long run, he wins again. Maybe we'll never know the true monetary cost of the rebrand, but if I were a fan of the team, I'd have to question if it were my soul.
We are Commanders. Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum. And there you have it. That's sewage.
I had to handle the situation with a lot of poise and show compassion for the people that fell down, really. But I know it could have been so much worse.
When you look at every list of the worst stadiums in the NFL, there is one that is almost unanimously at the bottom. That would be the stench-filled dumpster fire that is FedEx Field. Opened in 1997, FedEx was once the largest capacity stadium in the NFL, peaking at over 90,000. It was state-of-the-art. But just like the franchise it houses, its fall from grace has been long, steady, and agonizing. Let's dive into the deep abyss that is the NFL's worst stadium. Why has FedEx Field gotten so bad is coming up right after this. Finding rock bottom. Identifying a singular moment as the worst one in FedEx Field's history is a tough one. There are so many examples of inexcusable stadium fails at this place that I could go on and on and on about how pathetic this place is. And that's exactly what we're going to do. You would think that a leaking pipe spewing literal shit water onto the crowd below would be rock bottom for this stadium, but somehow that's just the start. Posted on September 12, 2021, this viral video showed a damaged sewer line spewing filth into the lower bowl seating, a feat generally reserved for giant aging shitholes like the 50-year-old Oakland Coliseum, not for a 25-year-old stadium. But as you'll see in this video, things can still get worse. Here's a video allegedly taken by a stadium employee that shows the urinals also leaking. So whether you are indoors or outdoors at FedEx, you're either getting pissed on or pissed off. But hey, the only thing that rivals the sewage being dumped on the fans are the scummy fans themselves. Here's a lovely couple enjoying the stadium experience. Now, if you've ever been to a game, you'll know fights often happen in the stands, especially when the team is losing, between the many opposing fans that invade the stadium on game day to watch an easy win for the road team. To say that the upper deck can be frightening is an understatement. My wife, who used to be a Washington fan, has vowed never to bring our kids to a game. I've witnessed fans scrolling through nude pics on their phones, uttering every cuss word in the Urban Dictionary, and all around displaying scummy behavior that makes one think you've entered the NFL's version of Sodom and Gomorrah. Want a more specific example of an atrocious fan experience? How about the debacle that was the Sean Taylor tribute, a hastily put together exploitation of one of the team's most beloved players, coddled together at the last minute as a deflection from the team's email scandal, and starting out literally in front of the Porta-Johns and then somehow getting worse than that. Yes, the most fitting way to memorialize a man who played the game of football right is having the physical manifestation of everything Sean Taylor wasn't, doing TikTok dances on the turf that was painted with his number. Yo, I'm even embarrassed by this, and I make songs about shaving your balls. Still not rock bottom. And speaking of that turf, it's so bad that I'm surprised it hasn't taken a life out on the field. You can't say that the pattern of horrific injuries that have happened at FedEx Field is just coincidence. Alex Smith, RG3, Nick Gates earlier this season, Chase Young, Joe Burrow's knee shredded, Ryan Fitzpatrick. It's like the groundskeepers have given up on this place too. I hope in the next CBA the players union holds out on a ban on the turf at FedEx because it's out here killing their careers. Speaking of leaving on a stretcher, what about leaving the stadium, period? That feels like rock bottom every time. Horrible traffic pattern, lack of public transportation, parking lots where you have to walk through mud, and massive choke points all add up to sometimes 2 to 3 hours or even more just to leave the stadium grounds. On a night game, you might not be out of there until 2 a.m. And all that just to hop onto the wonderful roads that lie in the DMV, where traffic is so bad Satan himself is impressed. Which brings us, finally to rock bottom. On January 3rd, after watching the Eagles clinch a playoff berth on their hazardous turf, the fans got treated to the final straw that figuratively broke the camel's back. As Eagles QB Jalen Hurts headed to the locker room, a railway gave way, sending fans spilling into the walkway and narrowly missing Hurts. But not this poor cameraman. Oh, it gets even worse. According to the patrons who fell, the team staff did not offer a lick of concern nor medical attention to them, instead telling them to get the f off the field. It was so bad, Jalen Hurts himself sent a one-page letter to the NFL pleading for accountability and asking the team to take measures to prevent this from happening again. You know, simple things like proper welding. There you have it. This is what rock bottom for a maligned stadium looks like, and they are so damn lucky nobody was seriously hurt. But when fan safety comes into question, that is simply unacceptable. Injuries should happen out on the shitty grass, not in the stands. So now we're gonna find out just how we got here. How did it get this bad? To understand why FedEx Field is such a disaster, you have to go way back. All the way back to its predecessor, RFK Stadium, and their previous owner, Jack Kent Cooke. RFK was opened in 1960 and was a dual-use stadium situated in the nation's capital, and it got to witness the glory years of Redskin Dynasty. Yes, that's what the team was called back then. Look, RFK wasn't exactly Valhalla, it had its own problems, but at least the team saw success there, and it was serviceable. It also had a metro station nearby and wasn't terrible to get in and out of. When it finally aged out, Jack Kent Cooke used the building of a new stadium to spark up some old shit, in particular his longtime beef with the city of Baltimore. After years of blocking the city from trying to have an NFL franchise after they bolted in the middle of the night to Indy, Maryland finally got the Ravens, and this pissed Cooke off. His solution? Put his new stadium in their state as a giant f*** you. Yes, the new Jack Kent Cooke Stadium would be built out of spite in Maryland, a mere 43 minutes away from Baltimore. It's fitting that a petty beef would kick off this stadium's history, and it was set to open in 1997 with Mr. Cooke ready to oversee a new era of of Washington's success. Except God had other plans, and Cooke died before ever seeing a game in his self-aggrandizing memorial. In came the worst thing that has happened to the DC area since Jimmy Carter took office. Dan Snyder, who at the time was a little-known billionaire who made his money selling ads in doctor's office waiting rooms. Yes, that's how he made his money. You can look it up. Snyder's first order of business was erasing everything Jack Kent Cooke had to do with the team, including renaming the town the stadium was in, which bore the moniker Raljon for Cooke's two sons, and turning that back into Landover. The site itself was an awful choice from the start. The closest metro station is about a mile away, and there is no public shuttle service from that station to the stadium. The only option is private shuttle, something the team could offer, but hail to the no on that. So most people opt to walk the mile of shame, carrying their tailgate gear and whatever false hope they have for the team with them. Even sadder for the fans who get shit-faced during the game and have to aimlessly walk back to the metro 20 to 30 minutes after the team took another L. The alternative to this public transportation is paying the outrageous parking fees and getting trapped in the giant lot for 3 hours after the game while your soul dies a little more with each passing minute. Snyder even attempted to ban walking down the lone access road to the stadium to encourage more parking, but that was quelled on account that the fans would probably burn the stadium down if he did that. After maximizing the revenue outside of FedEx, Snyder then started altering the inside of the stadium to include paid membership areas called party zones to squeeze out that coin. He added dream seats near the sidelines that cost more than the box seats, yet were too low to the field and the view was obstructed by the actual players on the sideline. As on-field play declined, so did the seating capacity, as FedEx was once the largest capacity stadium in the league. However, over the years, more areas have been closed as attendance has eroded. In fact, 15,000 seats have been removed since the stadium opened, the last alteration coming in 2015. In 2018, it was discovered that the longtime season ticket waiting list, which many fans sat on for years in hopes of getting them, was a complete falsehood concocted to artificially increase ticket demand and use as leverage against those who already held season tickets as a threat to non-renewal. Jesus Christ. Over time, the 25-year-old stadium has increasingly decayed as multiple structural incidents have occurred just this last year. What's sad is this was once a state-of-the-art stadium with over a 90,000 seat capacity. Today it's in terrible condition, and while tone-deaf Dan Snyder takes out a 2-page layout on himself in the team's game day program in an attempt to wash himself of the scandals that fester in his building, the stadium, the franchise, and the poor fans die a slow, agonizing death. It's all sad, really. How do they fix it? At this point, the best option for the fans is to wait for the same fate that happened to Jack Kent Cooke to happen to Dan Snyder. Because with everything that has happened over the last quarter century, the only way that the team gets sold is literally over Dan Snyder's dead body. According to an article in May of 2021, Snyder plans on bringing a new stadium to the area by 2027, though not a single plan or location has been unveiled. Possible sites include Northern Virginia, because that'll be great for traffic, and DC, as Maryland is likely out for now, as sports gambling isn't legal in the state, and that's a factor. 2027 seems optimistic considering the DMV is built upon political red tape and backdoor deals. So good luck with all of that. Everybody knows the team needs new digs, but the sad reality for FedEx Field is that it's at the end of its life, and there is no reason to pour any more money into it with a renovation. Its other problems, like its location, are unfixable, and its owner, irredeemable. Why has FedEx Field gotten so bad? That's a good question, but the real question should be, was it ever good to begin with? Until next time.